introduction was basically telling us here. What was this moving toward two societies thing? What was going on?
He's talking about segregation and how the suburban and urban separatism of the African Americans and the whites were kind of developing into two societies.
Okay. Bella, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Oh yeah, that they were saying that they were two separate societies, but unequal. So.
And so, basically, even at the tail end of the civil rights movement, or the big era of the civil rights movement, we were moving more toward a separate society, moving more toward inequality. Okay? So, today, we are going to basically deal with the origins of the civil rights movement. Part of this is review, because the seeds of the civil rights movement kind of happened in World War II. So that part of it, I'm going to kind of ask you to fill in some gaps for me. Then we're going to cover civil rights during Eisenhower, and we will just touch on the civil rights in JFK. We'll just begin them. And so your entrance ticket for next time, you picked up letter from a Birmingham jail. What I'd like you to do is soaps it plus. I do want you to not just glance at it and find what the important things are. You should read it and kind of get a little bit of an understanding of it. Okay, it's one of those historic documents that you should ought to know. Okay? All right, so any questions on that? Yeah?
You said soaps plus?
This plus, so the plus part is usually when I tell you soaps, I want you to just kind of get the bare bones of what
scan it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I want you to do it a little more thoroughly. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, any other questions on it? Okay. Yeah. So, I started at the very end of last period. I kind of started the chapter on civil rights, and so let me just make sure we did talk about kind of that that Jim Crow society and how segregation was an issue both in the South and in the North. We did get that far. We didn't get that far.
Yeah.
We did. Okay. So when we take a quick step backward, and in this chapter, there's going to be a reference to kind of to various presidents, people that were involved, who were president during this movement. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of a timeline. We will use the presidents kind of as a reference, but in many ways, they are just like I put it here, a timeline. The presidents are a good way of determining where we are, but oftentimes it's the actions of others that really drive what happens in this movement. And if indeed there is a presidential role, it was usually one of reaction as opposed to taking action. So the presidents of the kind of the civil rights era, one bookend is Roosevelt, who we're going to talk about how those seeds were planted during World War II. We'll then see major roles with Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and really it's under Johnson that the movement kind of really explodes. But then bookend again, the movement kind of slows down a bit under Richard Nixon, or changes under Richard Nixon. So this is kind of the meat of the civil rights era.
Who's LBJ?
LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson. Hey, LBJ, how many kids you killed today? Yeah, that was a chanter in Vietnam War. They weren't fun. All right, so do you have that kind of down? So let's go back to World War II. And so this would be under FDR for the most part. And what I like to think about as far as World War II is think of seeds being sown. What will later blow up and become a full-blown movement, the seeds for that were planted during World War II. When, during the war, we had an expansion of industrial capacity in the United States. Thus, there was this demand for labor. And one of the ways the United States filled that demand for labor was a continuance of the Great Migration, people moving out of the South up to American cities and working in American factories. But African Americans who went to work in those factories found that even though the demand for labor was high, there was still discriminatory practices as to what types of jobs people got, what type of pay people got. And so, there was this guy by the name of A. Philip Randolph. And so here's one of those fill-in things. A. Philip Randolph, what is his big role as far as conditions of discrimination and whatnot in the wartime factories? What role did he play? Okay, we've got our Fab Four that always answers, but this should be on. There should be other people here. Okay, yeah.
Didn't he threaten to march on Washington, like protest?
Yeah. So he threatened this march on Washington, and so everybody envision in the middle of World War II, we're fighting the super racist Nazis, and what could have possibly happened was this massive march that basically would show the United States off as being a racist society. And so, FDR, is this something that he wants to have happen? Not no. Hell. Okay. And so, FDR issues Executive Order 8802, which basically does what? Okay, what does it do?
Prohibits discrimination in, like, I think it was wartime industries.
Yeah. So if you had contract for the United States government to build stuff for the United States government during the war, you could not practice discrimination on the basis of race. Okay. So it's a huge executive order. It's an important executive order. It was an executive order done by FDR. But probably worth noting, even though we kind of said it already, did he come about this really on his own? Would he wake up one morning and went, oh, I think I should discriminate, I should desegregate the factories, or was he pushed? He was pushed. Okay, so there was only, did he jump or was he pushed? He was pushed. Okay. The final thing that I kind of want you to make sure you remember from the World War II unit was this slogan, the double V. The double V. So what was the slogan? You got yours in. Okay, so there's other people. We have more than 2 people in the room. There's like 38 of you. Okay, yes.
Wasn't it for like double victory? You know, victory over like the Nazis and victory at home.
Civil rights over racism. Okay, so the double V became a very, very powerful slogan. Okay, for this early civil rights movement, this World War II civil rights movement, basically building on what was already a thing during the war. People were saying V is for victory, and it's a no, double V. Okay. Now, because of really these actions, we're going to see a huge increase in membership in civil rights organizations. One, the NAACP, which already existed. Two, a new civil rights organization is formed. It was known as the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. It's founded by James Farmer in 1942, and its methods, what it would say, this is how we are going to do things, this is how we're going to make our demands as far as civil rights, is we are going to follow the example of Mahatma Gandhi. We are going to protest, we are going to practice civil disobedience, but we are going to do it nonviolently. And so basically it had worked for Gandhi, it was going to work for African Americans in the United States. And so this was, so this all is kind of in place. And so again, I want you to think of the seeds are planted, okay? And the war ends. And then right after the end of the war, we have kind of one of those big trigger events, or at least a helpful event as far as getting things triggered. It happened in Major League Baseball. Brooklyn Dodgers, okay? Major League Baseball, even in the North, was segregated. We had the American League, we had the National League, and we had the Negro League. Brooklyn Dodgers are going to make a massive change. They are going to bring African American Jackie Robinson, who went to UCLA right over here. If you go watch UCLA baseball, you can watch it in Jackie Robinson Stadium. Jackie Robinson is brought up, okay, to play on the Brooklyn Dodgers. He breaks a barrier. And it was not one that people just simply went, oh, okay, it's done, whatever. It was one that people fought, people protested, people took actions against both Jackie Robinson and his teammates. The team oftentimes would end up being split up and segregated when they went to go play in places. It was a very, very hard-fought thing, but it kind of acts as our catalyst to getting things going. The last of the big seeds kind of in the 1940s. It's going to happen from kind of an unlikely place, okay? If you had met Harry Truman and you talked to him, it was very, very likely he would use kind of racist language, maybe make racist jokes. Okay, he was a Southerner, okay, and he acted that way. But Truman was also someone who believed in equality before the law. And so whatever his maybe social beliefs might have been, he believed that laws were something that they said something, that if there's a law written, that it should ought to be followed. Secondly, he also, if you recall, the big thing that we're going to remember Harry Truman for, what's the big thing that he's notable for, is being Mr. Cold Warrior. Okay? And what helped shape his policies very often is what role would this play in the Cold War versus the Russians? And so, kind of like the same thing that was kind of presented to FDR. Here we are in the struggle against the Soviet Union, and in the struggle with the Soviet Union, the United States wants to put out there to the world this face of being this fabulous democracy. If the United States could not deal with its race issues, this face of being so fabulously democratic, and if we're trying to get other countries to follow our example, does that help our cause or does it hurt our cause? It hurts. And so these are considerations that that are playing in Truman's mind when an issue comes before him. And what the issue was, it was something that had happened also at the end of World War I. Okay? What happened after World War II, like after World War I, is that as African American soldiers came home from the war, okay, oftentimes a little bit, hey, okay, I just fought for my country, okay? There was a huge uptick in the number of lynchings. And Truman was alarmed by the fact that that basically this was being done to, well, soldiers from the United States. So Truman is going to do something different than Woodrow Wilson. You know, Woodrow Wilson, what action did he take? No action. Okay, maybe he went home and watched the Klansman again in his White House private theater. Truman's going to do is he is going to order a special commission to basically look into why is this stuff happening here in the United States? What's causing it? And what this Presidential Commission, the Presidential Committee on Civil Rights in 1947, what it determines, okay, is part of the problem is the government of the United States. The commission issues a report known as To Secure These Rights. And that basically what the committee says is that how can you expect there to be equitable treatment in American society if the federal government doesn't practice equitable treatment? And so what the committee is going to recommend is that Truman take measure, that Truman take steps, that Truman desegregate the United States civil service and the United States military. Truman does it. Okay. By executive order, he desegregates the United States civil service. He desegregates the military. The military fought against it. They said that it would not work. Turned out that in the military it actually worked very well because it was one of those things where eventually you can just simply order people. But for Truman to have done this, it wasn't free. There's going to be a cost. And what the cost to Truman will be is that Southern Democrats are going to be extraordinarily angered by this move. Southern Democrats will leave, at least temporarily, the Democratic Party and form the Southern, the States' Rights Democratic Party. They will nominate Strom Thurmond for the presidency in 1948. Additionally, on this split, if you look at the Democratic Party of today, we now have really a different Democratic Party than Truman had in the early 1940s. Because eventually, by the 1960s, Southern Democrats will switch over and become Republicans. Particularly when Richard Nixon says that he would take a strict construction attitude toward enforcing civil rights. And then finally, the other major cost to Truman is that when he actually won the election of 1948, he had a very ambitious plan. He was going to do national health care. He was going to increase the minimum wage. He was going to expand the opportunity for poor people to get housing. And all of those ideas will be blocked by Southern Democrats or members of the States' Rights Democratic Party. He will get nothing done. The other thing I want to bring up is that during this huge civil rights movement that was happening in the big headlines, the African American civil rights movement, there were other civil rights movements that were happening at the same time, sometimes even taking the lead. Notably, there was a condition here in the Southwest, California, Arizona, Texas, okay, where principally Mexican-American workers, remember that there had been an increase of Mexican-American workers in the United States because of the Bracero program during World War II. Well, here in California, in Arizona, and in Texas, there was kind of a caste system practice that was similar to Jim Crow laws. And there's going to be a movement to basically get rid of this separation, kind of segregation that was developing, particularly in California, Arizona, and Texas. Now, one of the fronts in this fight will be among Mexican-American veterans from the war. Much like what happened to African Americans, where some of the benefits, such as the help on mortgages, remember how African Americans were redlined? Well, the Veterans Administration was doing the same thing to Mexican Americans here in California. And so an organization, the American GI Forum, was founded by Mexican American veterans of the war to fight these practices. A second major front happened here in California, down in Orange County. In Orange County, in a city called Westminster, they would take Mexican American children and place them in separate schools. Segregation. Well, a group of parents decided to protest this. They decided to sue. And their case will go all the way up through the federal court system to the top court system out here in the West, lower than the Supreme Court. It's called the Ninth Circuit Court. And at the Ninth Circuit Court, they will declare, in a case called Mendez versus Westminster, that the practice of segregating Mexican American students into special schools was illegal. This will be one of the cases that will help set the precedent later in a case called Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Okay? So in other words, this action, this case here in California, okay, will help lead to the overturning of Plessy versus Ferguson. The other thing, as far as the influence of the Mendez case, was that the governor of California, who had to, in effect, implement this decision, was a guy by the name of Earl Warren. The Chief Justice that issues the opinion in the Topeka versus Brown decision, Earl Warren. Obviously influenced by this case. So, this was just to get the ball rolling. So let's see how you all are kind of putting everything together. So part of what we talked about a little bit was review. So what I would like you to do is a quick commentary on the early civil rights movement in the 40s. A, the role of the activists, B, the role of FDR, C, the role of Truman. Okay, so evaluate, grade each, comment each. So you should have three grades, 3 comments. The activists, comment. FDR, comment. Truman, comment.
Life could be a dream, life could be a dream. Life could be a dream. If I could take you up in paradise up above. If you would tell me I'm the only one that you love. Life could be a dream. Sweetheart, hello, hello again. Shaboom, and open the media boom. They only ding dong, shalang. Oh, mountain. I move over the road. Life could be a dream. If only all my precious plans would come true. If you would let me spend my whole life loving you. Life could be a dream, sweetheart. Every time I look at you, something is on. If you do what I want you to, baby, we be so high. Life could be a dream. Shaboom, if I can take you up in paradise up above. Shaboom, you know me, darling, I'm the only one that you love. Life could be a dream. Sweetheart, hello again. Shaboom, and hope for me, shaboom, boom.
So turn to your White House and just converse real quick.
Thumbs up or say
Society that people will
Are you okay?
Please go ahead.
Excellent. All right, so finish your sentence. Okay, so student 18. Oh man, it's Cleo. Cool enough. All right, so Cleo, choose one of the three. Give a grade.
Okay, I said A for activists because they use the wartime pressures to their advantage.
Nice. Okay, so let's go with student 8. Okay, and Chase. Chase, okay. So you get FDR or Truman, either one, give a grade and a comment.
I gave Truman a B+, and I said because he ended segregation in civil service and he actually investigated the lynchings.
Excellent. Okay. And student 15, you are stuck with FDR. Chloe. Hey, Chang.
For FDR, I said like a B plus, A minus, because I'm pretty sure didn't he end racism in the workplace?
Yes. Discrimination in the factories. Okay. All right. Okay. So so we have kind of a picture of this early movement, right? So now let us move to the kind of the first phase of change in the post-war era, and what this first kind of set of battles will be mainly legal ones. Okay. That idea that Truman said he believed in, equality before the law. If we're going to have somebody who's going to be kind of our focus, let's pick an NAACP lawyer by the name of Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall is going to make it kind of his mission to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. He hoped to use an argument which would involve the Equal Protection Clause of the Fourth Amendment, saying that that segregation basically does not allow for equal protection under the law. So just to kind of wrap your mind around this, this argument is being used currently in a particular issue. Does anyone know the particular issue that the Equal Protection Clause is being cited as a reason for change nationally? Yeah. Yeah, in particular marriage equality. Okay, so that because of different states having different practices toward marriage is not equal. What the idea is that citing the Equal Protection Clause, there needs to be a national standard. Anyway, Marshall had filed in the Westminster versus Mendez case. He had filed a brief in support of the plaintiffs. arguing this equal protection argument. That was redundant, but you get the point. Okay. Now, flash forward a lot. Eventually, Thurgood Marshall will be named by Lyndon Baines Johnson when he is president to be the first African American on the United States Supreme Court. Now that's later, but I think it's worth us knowing right now. So now, this idea of equal protection, where does it show up nationally? Well, in the case, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Thurgood Marshall will be one of the people filing this suit on behalf of Linda Brown, arguing that being denied the ability to go to the school, perhaps that was even closer to her home, to go to a segregated school, okay, was denying her equal protection. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at that time was Earl Warren. Now, he had been appointed to the Supreme Court because he had supported Eisenhower during the election of 1952. He had been governor of California. He had used his influence as governor of California to help get Eisenhower the nomination, helped him get win, and Eisenhower is going to make him a promise. Okay, if I win, the next available seat on the Supreme Court is yours. Well, the next available seat on the Supreme Court was Chief Justice. Now, Eisenhower tried to back off. He tried to say to Earl Warren that he would make him just a justice and elevate someone else as Chief Justice, but Earl Warren would have none of it. He says, "You said next available seat." And so Eisenhower makes him Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Turns out that Eisenhower had appointed the person who will become perhaps the biggest social activist ever to serve on the United States Supreme Court, let alone be Chief Justice, as Chief Justice. If I were to make a recommendation of Supreme Court Chief Justices I should know before the AP exam, John Marshall, Earl Warren would be two of them. Anyway, what Earl Warren will manage to do is to create a unanimous 9-0 decision in favor of Linda Brown. Now, does anyone know why unanimous is so important as far as the Supreme Court is concerned? There's several reasons. I mean, obvious, the more the better is always good. But why particularly in the Supreme Court? Why is it so important to have unanimous?
Well, I don't know, like, just because I've done before, I know that the dissent of a Supreme Court justice holds a lot of weight. So, like, I've used a dissent for an argument, like, in my, like, argument, and so it holds a lot of weight. So,
Yeah.
unanimous makes it so, like, there's no room for argument either way.
Precisely. If there's a dissent, that means that somebody else is writing an opinion. And if you disagree with the opinion, where are you going to look for ways maybe to get around the opinion? Where are you going to look for ways to craft laws that might go against the decision? You look in the dissent. And so, without a dissent, it's going to make it harder. Secondly, what this decision does is it says that the idea that had been put forth in Plessy versus Ferguson, okay, that separate but equal is okay. Well, what it argues is that separation was inherently unequal. that as soon as you do a separation, you are creating a system of inequality. And basically, that makes it unconstitutional as far as equal protection under the law. And thus, effectively, Plessy versus Ferguson is overturned. Now, by the way, this is technically only in schools because of the fact that's what the case was about. But obviously, can you now take this case and apply it to all other types of social issues? Yeah. So, everybody look at this case. It is amazing. It's important. It should be celebrated. Okay. It effectively knocks down what had been over a half century of what the court said was okay in the United States. However, 10 years after Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, only 2% of the classrooms in the Deep South had been desegregated. So I want you all to remember back. Remember how back under Andy Jackson, the Marshall Court had made a ruling against Indian removal. And what was Andy Jackson's reaction to that decision? I'm not going to force it. And so what we end up with here is essentially the same problem. That you have a ruling, but the ruling is only as strong as the federal government is willing to actually carry it out. And effectively, what had the United States been doing as far as civil rights as really since Reconstruction? Additionally, in Congress, there were 101 members of Congress who are going to sign basically a petition that we now call the Southern Manifesto. And what this petition basically did is it denounced the Brown decision as a clear abuse of judicial power, judicial activism. That the court was going beyond its scope when it basically created the Brown decision. These 101 Congress people would go on and say that segregation was integral to the South's habits, traditions, and way of life. You can't just come along as court and say, hey, how y'all live is wrong. And so, what these 101 members of Congress are basically now going to say is states, local school districts, defy it. Don't do it. We have your back. That here in Congress, we are with you. What notion are they basically supporting here? Nullification, states' rights, compact theory. Got it? But in 1957, we're now going to see what President Eisenhower had to say on the matter. So the decision, by the way, was all the way back in '54. Okay, and Eisenhower was someone who, the United States had gone through so much lately. They had, depression, war, crisis with the Soviet Union in Berlin, another war in Korea. Enough already. We need to chillax. We need to not be such an active government anymore. And so, basically, Eisenhower initially was very little inclined toward promoting integration. Okay, so he was not going to just go, okay, that's Supreme Court, you gotta do it. That is not what he didn't feel that was his role. Additionally, he in effect almost agreed with those 101 senators or congresspeople, and basically saying that the Brown decision went against 2 generations of American customs and conventions. And so therefore, did he want to make a major move, change in American society? No, he didn't. If there was going to be change, you would call him a gradualist. It's got to be done more slowly. But in 1957, something happens which is going to force Eisenhower to actually take action. Nine kids younger than y'all. 9 kids, okay, who decide that if the government isn't going to desegregate, they are. So 9 kids decide that they are going to integrate Little Rock Central High School. The Little Rock 9. The governor of Arkansas will react to this integration plan by mobilizing the Arkansas National Guard. In other words, he is sending in troops to prevent 9 children from going to school. But, in a way, the governor of Arkansas, his name was Orville Faubus, by the way. You can't make this stuff up. Orville, okay? Orville Faubus. In a way, his method of blocking this integration is going to be what forces Eisenhower to act. Because what did Faubus use? The National Guard. The National Guard first serves the governor, but in reality, what is it part of? It's part of the United States government. It's part of the federal government. And so basically what Faubus was doing is he was using the federal government against itself. He was using the federal government to basically block, okay, the implementation of a federal law or a federal decision. And so it's decision time for Eisenhower. He wasn't into promoting integration, but could he allow a state to defy integration in this fashion, of even using the National Guard against it? And Eisenhower decided no, he could not. And so Eisenhower goes from being a sideline player to someone who's going to take action. What he does is first, he is going to call the National Guard up into federal service. So basically, the National Guard sitting there preventing the kids from going to school, he now says, you have to switch teams. You are now going to help the kids go to school. However, can he necessarily trust this group of Arkansas soldiers to be that supportive of the Little Rock Nine? And the answer is no. So what is he going to do? He's going to send in the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army. And literally, troops in troop carrier trucks, jeeps with machine guns, guys with bayonets on the tips of their guns, okay, automatic weapons, lay siege to Little Rock.
How many?
It was a large number of troops. I don't know the exact number, but it was multiple troop carriers coming in, if that makes sense. Anyway, so now Eisenhower basically joins in effectively forcing the integration in Little Rock, Arkansas. Got it? If you ever look at the footage, you look up Little Rock 9 on YouTube and see the footage. The confrontations that between those who were opposed to this integration and these kids wanting to go to school, I mean, are something you should ought to look at. This is a still photo on Elizabeth Eckford got separated from the rest of the Little Rock Nine, and basically the crowd closes in around her. And this woman, famously or infamously, just starts letting off all these racial epithets just right there, right in her face. Interestingly enough, just about 5 years ago, she contacted Elizabeth Eckford and basically tried to apologize after all that time.
40 years later.
So, Thurgood Marshall, Earl Warren, they had changed things at the court level. But what was still lacking was that the United States government was not taking an active role yet in enforcing desegregation or integration. And so the next phase of the movement is that basically people are now going to realize that court actions are not enough, and that they need to, in effect, take action, like the Little Rock Nine, in order to get action from the federal government. This kind of decision was galvanized by another kind of national event. And what the national event was the murder of a young man by the name of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a boy from Chicago, and he's going to be down visiting his relatives in Mississippi. And basically, as the story goes, while in some general store or something like that, Emmett Till talked to a white woman. He broke the code. So that night, a group of white men will take, torture, and murder Emmett Till. Eventually, they will tie his body to a cotton gin fan and toss it in a river. that even though lynching was going on, and it wasn't that this was different from anything that really was going on in the South at all, that this particular case caught the nation's ear, the nation's eyes, as photographs of Emmett Till are shown of him, and they had his coffin open for people to see. And when the trial for the murderers of Emmett Till, when they went to trial, one of Emmett Till's relatives, a guy by the name of Mose Wright, will basically, point, yes, these are the guys. They're the ones that did it. But an all-white jury will find them innocent. They will then go on and brag to a national magazine that they had actually committed the crime. Yeah.
Is that a confession?
It was after they had been found innocent.
Isn't
Yeah.
there?
Most of those things that you're now thinking of are because of civil rights law that have now been passed that can now find somebody guilty of violating someone's civil rights. But murder, there's no double jeopardy. Does that make sense? So, anyway, this murder, okay, kind of lights a fire. And we're now going to see kind of a flood of actions. Yeah?
How old was Emmett Till?
14.
Oh, do we know what he said to the white woman?
Wasn't it like "hi baby" or something, or just it was like almost a phrase? Yeah.
Yeah, I heard it was a whistle.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not. I mean, does it matter? So, one of these first big actions, you should know this story, okay? This is one of those ones which, going all the way from elementary school, you should know this story. But in 1955, there was an NAACP worker by the name of Rosa Parks, who had been wanting for a long time to just do something. But one day she does. One day, she will violate Montgomery, Alabama's segregation ordinance by refusing to give up her seat in the whites-only section of a bus. Her subsequent arrest will lead to a boycott of the Montgomery buses for over a year. And so during that year, you will get national attention to this protest. During this year, a leader will come to prominence in the civil rights movement. His name is Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And basically what Dr. King will do is he will use those same ideas that James Farmer had called for in CORE. He will use a combination of civil disobedience, okay, nonviolence, okay, and protest. The boycott will eventually lead the court to declaring the segregation of the buses to be illegal. But perhaps more importantly, it will allow Dr. King to assume this leadership and form a new civil rights organization known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, oftentimes just simply mentioned as the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Yes, sir.
When was that photo taken? Is that original photo?
Pardon me? That's right. I believe they stopped the bus, and when she refused to take her to move.
And a photographer came on to the photo?
So it's a famous, I mean, if you back here, you
Yeah.
see my painting that you've probably seen all year.
That's like a really good question.
Another action happens in 1960. And again, who is it that takes action? Who is it that becomes so powerful? It's going to be young people. In this case, a group of college students in Greensboro, North Carolina. Okay, we call them the Greensboro Four. And what they were determined to do was to force the Woolworths Company to change its practice, okay, of having an all-white lunch counter. Woolworths, they called them five and dimes. They sold kind of stuff that you might find at CVS now. And basically, when they were selling, all customers could come in, spend your money, buy stuff at the five and dime. But if you want to sit down at the diner, you had to be white. What's that?
Was it right?
You had to be white.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
That's the wrong answer.
All right. So what these guys decide to do is purposely violate the law, purposely violate the sign, and they sit down at the counter. You go to the Smithsonian Museum, you can see the four seats that they sat at. Okay, they're there. This will inspire others. Okay, they will continue to sit at this counter because they will not get served, and other people will hear about it and they'll come and sit at the counter too. Later, when actually the college students went on spring break, the high school students locally came and sat in their places for them to make sure that the protest kept going. People objected, people would attack them, people would throw food at them, people shook them, did anything to try and make them give up their protest. But all it did is made the numbers grow. Finally, Woolworths decides that the negative publicity could not go on. And so they did a symbolic desegregation. After closing one night, they had the African American employees of the lunch counter sit down at the lunch counter, and they served them. This movement will lead to similar sit-ins across the South, mainly the Upper South, but Virginia, Tennessee, Nashville, but even as far south as Jackson, Mississippi. Similar protests, similar results. Yes, sir.
Why weren't they just arrested?
What you're going to see in some of these cases, what will end up happening is once they arrest one group, another group ends up taking their place. The technique, fill up the jails. Just, you keep doing it, we'll just keep more people to come and take our place. It was, eventually, it became a very organized way of doing things, if that makes sense. The sit-in movement will spawn the creation of another civil rights group known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee. They called it SNCC. Now, initially, the groups, these students, wanted to kind of affiliate themselves with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But an organizer from the SCLC, a woman by the name of Ella Baker, she wanted the students to basically stay out on their own. She thought that they would be far more powerful that way. She also believed that ordinary people were the power of the civil rights movement, and that it was ordinary people that needed to stand up for their rights rather than relying on a charismatic leader. So, now, obviously, Dr. King was completely an important part of the movement, but for Ella Baker, it was the people that were the power. So this is the Greensboro Four in their seats. You can see those same seats at the Smithsonian. This is the Woolworths in Greensboro, and me and myself. It's now a fabulous civil rights museum. And just to give you, on Friday, I think what I'm going to do for the film is I'm going to show a shorter thing that it won't necessarily take all lunch. But there was a documentary made on the civil rights movement years ago called Eyes on the Prize. And its segment on the sit-ins is truly inspiring. So, if you don't normally go to the lunchtime films, this is a good one to. It's a good one to see. If you're trying to capture just how powerful the sit-in movement was. So. Let's do it again. We've now gone through another administration. And so what I'd like you to do once again is do a 3-grade thing. I'd like you to evaluate and comment A, the movement, B, Eisenhower, C, the actions of the Supreme Court. Grade and comment, 1 for each. So why don't you, let's stay with your White House, why not? Just talk it out. Did you? Swear.
It's a doggy.
Right on stuff.
What do you mean? With you. He was driving up. I do pick up soul. I never have wanted to pick up soul. I do. I would literally
All right.
I don't have a son anymore.
So let us find. Same people who can call them. Not very random. This random number generator. Okay. Justin AG.
For the civil rights movement, I gave them an A because you want me to all three.
Do you want to do just one, or do you want to do all three? It's up to you.
I'll do all three. So
Awesome.
For the movement, I said that it was a strong movement that had a lot of support.
Mhm.
Like there were always people willing to do it, so gave them an A. Supreme Court, gave them an A because they turned over Plessy versus Ferguson, and it was good how they let all students go to school and did more segregation. And then I gave Eisenhower an A because he used the National Guard against the governor of Arkansas and escorted the kids to school.
Okay. Awesome. Anybody else want to weigh in? Volunteers? Yes.
I think Eisenhower beat just because he initially supported the 21 members of Congress, saying that he was running, how he running against he was like trying to support the Southern Northwest.
So he didn't jump into it.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts? All right. So. So now, ladies and gentlemen, JFK. Now, Kennedy had became president in 1960, or was elected president in 1960. He defeated Richard Nixon, and in this election, he kind of turned the tables on Nixon. In 1952, he had used television to kind of keep himself on the ticket for vice president. In 1960, in a televised debate, the gorgeous Jack Kennedy came off looking much better in a televised debate than Nixon did. And in this particular case, we actually have a little bit of data showing how influential television was, because when they did polls, they actually asked a question whether or not they had watched the debate on television or they had heard the debate on the radio. And the people that said that they had watched it on television had said that Jack Kennedy had clearly won the debate. But the people who listened to it on the radio had said Nixon. So it's one of those things of, your presentation, how you look, what you do. It makes a difference. Anyway, the election turned out to be a squeaker. It was really, 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 really close. And in many ways, it came down to the state of Illinois. The state of Illinois ends up voting for Kennedy. But there was kind of an interesting thing that happened there. In Illinois, every precinct outside of Chicago sent in their returns, okay, as to who their precinct was voting for. But for some reason, all of the precincts within Chicago failed to report. And they failed to report until every single other precinct in all of Illinois had reported. And then finally, when the Chicago precincts reported, it turns out that they came up with just enough votes to cancel out the fact that Nixon had won the rest of the state and Kennedy could carry the state. There were many who called for Nixon to protest the election, but Nixon felt that it would not look good for American democracy to have that type of challenge out there. But during the election, Kennedy had made a promise, in particular to Coretta Scott King, Dr. King's wife. He had made a promise that he would deal with the civil rights issue with a stroke of a pen. Powerful statement. And basically, what did it possibly mean? Was he going to take some sort of executive action? Was he going to use federal power to uphold the implementation of Topeka versus Brown? What was he going to do with a stroke of a pen? This promise had led the African American community to come out very, very strongly for Kennedy in the election, and might have been a huge difference maker in his election. But it turns out that in the first couple years of Kennedy's presidency, he did very little on the civil rights issue. Now, the reason why is actually fairly simple. What had happened to Truman? Truman had an ambitious agenda. He had wanted to do all sorts of things, like national health care, that type of thing. But Southern congresspeople had blocked him, had stopped him, had killed the fair deal. Well, Kennedy had similar ambition. He had this program called the New Frontier. And he wanted this to work. He wanted to do things. And he knew that if he all of a sudden took an immediate action on civil rights, everything else he wanted to do would be sabotaged. And so, nothing at first. Now, civil rights leaders would do things like send him pens and bottles of ink in the mail to remind him of his promise. He actually ended up being most disappointing to them on January 1st, 1963. Because what civil rights leaders imagined is, think of the symbolism. January 1st, 1963 was the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And what civil rights leaders imagined, and it could only be an imagination because he never did anything, but they imagined that Kennedy would do that stroke of a pen on that day, that he would take action on that day. And so again, what on the early return on Kennedy regarding civil rights is that it was very similar to Eisenhower on civil rights. Proactive? No. Reactive? Yes. You will take the actions of others to make Kennedy react early on. One of those actions which will call for a Kennedy reaction was known as the Freedom Rides. This was a protest put on by the civil rights organization CORE. Do you remember James Farmer's CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality? What CORE was going to do is it was going to try and end segregation on interstate buses. Bus companies like Greyhound. And why do you think they chose interstate buses rather than like the MTA Los Angeles? Why do you think interstate buses? Yeah.
Because interstate commerce is regulated by federal law.
Yeah. So in other words, they are trying to go into the area that is the federal government's responsibility and in effect force Kennedy to act. So what they do is CORE members would basically do something very, very simple. CORE was a multi-ethnic organization. And so white members of CORE would go get on buses and sit in the African American sections on buses, and the African American members of CORE would go sit in the white section. When the buses stopped at bus stations, they would basically violate whatever signs there were. Okay, it said white, African American went there. It said black. The white members went there. It went for waiting rooms, it went for restrooms. Basically, if there was a sign, they pretty much violated it. Okay? It was met with rioting, particularly in Alabama. Buses that had Freedom Riders on it were attacked. They were torched. They were bombed. They had bricks thrown. They had stones thrown. Okay. Eventually, the Greyhound Bus Drivers Union demanded the right to arm themselves, to protect themselves as they drove these buses. Finally, Kennedy reacts. And interestingly, when I say Kennedy reacts, it is his administration, but in particular, it is Kennedy who reacts. Attorney General Bobby Kennedy reacts. And what Bobby Kennedy will do is he will send in federal marshals. Okay, so you've heard of air marshals? Think now bus marshals. Okay, marshals to defend the Freedom Riders, to protect the Freedom Riders. So the last topic I want to talk about today, and it's kind of also going to be our springboard for next time. Yeah, next time is what day is next time? What day is today? But it's the what day of the week?
Thursday.
It's Tuesday, right?
Today is Tuesday.
Thank you. So no, I'm just trying to figure out because of so we have a full class period on Thursday. So we'll have, I think, an abbreviated class period next Monday. Okay. Anyway, so I'm just trying to see what pace I can do right now. So the next kind of phase of our civil rights movement is going to be trying to get the government to enforce, in effect, civil rights. Now, if you think about civil rights, I want you to go back to Reconstruction. And during Reconstruction, the United States government passed a civil rights bill in 1866, which basically then morphed into the 14th Amendment. Okay, so that was kind of the establishment of civil rights, particularly for African Americans in the United States. The Congress will then pass in 1875 a civil rights bill, which basically guaranteed equal accommodation in public spaces. Okay, in effect, it was an anti-segregation idea. But in the 1890s, in a series of cases known as the civil rights cases, the United States Supreme Court overturns the Civil Rights Act of 1875. We don't have another attempt by the federal government to actually pass an enforcement of civil rights law until 1957. So 1957 is the first civil rights law since Reconstruction. The reason it passes is actually fairly simple. Politics. You see, in 1957, when Eisenhower sends in troops to desegregate Little Rock Central High School, guess what the only party that had done anything really for civil rights lately was? The Republicans. And so Democratic leaders panic because if now it's the Republicans that were perhaps helping in civil rights, mightn't African Americans bail on the Democratic Party and return to the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. And so a senator from Texas by the name of Lyndon Baines Johnson will basically convince, okay, even Southern leaders that it was imperative to the Democratic Party to keep control of places like the United States Senate that they pass a civil rights bill. And so, Lyndon Baines Johnson pulls out every trick he had in the book, and he knew lots of tricks. He gets a civil rights bill passed. The thing is that this civil rights bill is really more of a bill in name only. as far as its powers, it was extraordinarily weak. What the Civil Rights Bill of 1957 did is it created the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And you know what that commission could do? It could study government policies dealing with equal protection. Oh my. They could investigate. I bet you they could even have meetings. Okay? Hearings. They could invite in witnesses. They could ask, well, what do you think about the civil rights? Do you think that something ought to be done? Oh, yes, they did. Well, by the 1960s, okay, as we see that the federal government has done nothing, really, to basically implement the Brown decision. What civil rights people wanted was a true law with true teeth that makes people follow the United States Constitution, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. And so next time, what we're going to talk about is how civil rights leaders are now going to demand a powerful law. Eventually, this will be the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the 24th Amendment to the United States Constitution. What I'd like you to do in preparation for this is what I told you at the beginning of the period. I'm just reminding you is to read the letter from my Birmingham jail, do the SOAPs technique to it, but also kind of know it, kind of understand it. What's Dr. King trying to say? All right? Any questions, comments, or concerns?